I went to the cabin alone because I needed quiet. That was the honest reason, I told myself. Work had been grinding me down for months. Sleep was bad. My head felt loud all the time. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, barely used, sitting deep in a patch of forest hours from the nearest town. No cell service, no neighbors, no noise except whatever the woods decided to make. I thought that kind of isolation would reset me. I didn't think about how isolation can turn on you. The drive out there already felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The last stretch was a dirt road that hadn't been graded in years. Deep tire ruts, loose rocks, branches scraping the sides of my car. The trees closed in tighter the farther I went, tall pines and thick underbrush blocking out most of the sky. I remember noticing how quiet it got once I shut the engine off. Not peaceful quiet, just empty, like sound itself didn't want to hang around. The cabin looked older than I expected. One story, rough with siding darkened by weather, a tin roof with rust along the edges. The porch leaned slightly to one side, and the steps creaked even before I put weight on them. There was no power line running to it. Inside, it ran off a small generator and a propane heater. The windows were small and thick, the kind that make you feel like you're being watched even when nothing is there. I unlocked the door and the smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, something slightly sour like fabric that had stayed damp too long. I aired it out by opening the windows even though the air outside was cold. The place was simple. One main room with a table, 2 chairs, a couch that had seen better decades, and a small kitchen setup. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything felt solid but tired, like the cabin was holding itself together out of habit more than strength. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle into the space. Every sound I made felt louder than it should have. When I set my bag down, the thump echoed. When I walked, the floorboards complained under every step. I told myself that was normal for a place this old. Still, I kept catching myself pausing, listening, making sure the sound stopped when I stopped. Night came early. The forest swallowed the light fast, and once the sun was gone, it was truly dark. No glow from other houses, no distant traffic, nothing. Just black between the trees. I turned on the generator for a few hours, enough to get some light and cook a basic meal. The hum of it was oddly comforting. When I shut it off before bed, the silence rushed back in like water filling a hole. I lay on the bed fully dressed for a long time, staring at the ceiling. The mattress was thin, and every shift of my weight made the frame creak. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in slow waves. Branches brushed against the cabin now and then, a soft scraping sound that made my shoulders tense every time. I kept thinking I heard something else mixed in with it, something heavier, but every time I focused, it was just wind again. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. No dream that I could remember, just wide awake, heart beating too fast. The cabin was completely dark. My eyes adjusted slowly, shapes forming out of the black. That was when I realized the sound that woke me up wasn't random. It was rhythmic, a dull thud, spaced out, coming from somewhere outside. Not loud, careful, like someone trying not to make noise. I stayed still, listening. The sound stopped. The silence afterward felt worse than the noise. My mouth was dry, and I could feel my pulse in my neck. I told myself it was probably a branch falling, or something bumping into the cabin. Animals do that. That explanation should have been enough. It wasn't. I got out of bed and moved to the front window. I didn't turn on a light. I just pushed the curtain aside slightly and looked out. The darkness pressed up against the glass. I could barely see the edge of the porch. The forest beyond was just a solid wall of black. Nothing moved. Nothing reflected light. It felt like staring into a closed eye. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for something to prove me wrong. Eventually, the cold seeped into my feet, and I went back to bed. Sleep came in short, shallow pieces after that. I kept waking up, listening, convincing myself that every creak was just the cabin settling. In the morning, I found footprints near the porch. They weren't animal tracks. I knew that immediately. They were too clean, too evenly spaced. Human boot prints, pressed into the soft dirt near the steps. They didn't come from the road. They came from the tree line and stopped at the porch, like whoever made them had stood there for a while. Then they went back the same way. My first instinct was anger. The idea that someone had come that close while I slept made my stomach twist. The second instinct was fear, sharp and cold. I walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly, scanning the ground, the trees, everything. I didn't find more tracks, but I found something else. One of the small basement vents had been moved slightly, like someone had checked if it could be opened. I considered leaving right then. Packing up and driving away in daylight felt smart, but pride got in the way. I didn't want to admit I was scared by something that might have a normal explanation. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe someone curious who left when they realized the cabin was occupied. That logic calmed me enough to stay, but it didn't bring back the sense of peace I'd come for. The rest of the day dragged. I tried reading, but I couldn't focus. Every sound outside pulled my attention. Birds landing, leaves falling, distant cracking noises that could have been anything. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see a face where there never was one. That night, I locked the door and pushed the table against it. The cabin didn't have any real security, and that fact sat heavy in my chest. I left the generator off to save fuel, relying on lantern light. The shadows it cast made the corners of the room feel deeper than they should have been. The sounds started again after dark. Footsteps this time. Slow, deliberate steps on the porch. I could hear the wood creak under weight that wasn't mine. I froze in place, barely breathing. The steps stopped near the door. I waited for a knock that never came. Instead, there was the faint sound of something brushing against the door, like fingers testing the surface. I don't know how long it lasted. Time stretched thin. Eventually, the weight shifted away, and the footsteps faded into the forest. I didn't move for a long time after that. I stayed where I was until the lantern burned low and my legs ached from standing still. When the sun came up, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything as fast as I could, hands shaking, mind racing through worst-case thoughts. Before I left, I did one last check of the cabin. Near the back window, low to the ground, I saw fresh scratches in the dirt, right below the sill. Marks where someone had crouched, watching inside. I drove away without looking back. The dirt road felt longer than it had on the way in. Every bend made me expect to see someone standing there, waiting. When I finally hit pavement and my phone buzzed back to life with missed notifications, I felt a release so strong it made me lightheaded. Later, after I calmed down, I reported what happened. The local sheriff didn't sound surprised. He told me the area had problems with transients moving through the forest, people looking for places to squat, steal, or just hide. Cabins like that were easy targets, especially ones that sat empty most of the year. He said I was lucky they didn't try harder to get in. That word stuck with me. Lucky. I still think about that cabin sometimes. Not in a dramatic way, just in flashes. The quiet, the darkness pressed against the windows, the feeling of being observed without ever seeing who was doing the watching. It wasn't a monster or anything unreal. It was just another person, somewhere out there, close enough to touch the door while I lay inside pretending nothing was wrong. That's what makes it stick. The fact that it was real and it could have gone a lot worse. I rented the cabin because it was cheap and because it was far away from everything. I didn't want neighbors. I didn't want traffic noise. I didn't want people. The listing was short and plain, almost careless. No reviews, just a few photos that showed a small wooden cabin surrounded by trees and nothing else. It said it was accessible by an old logging road and recommended arriving before dark. I ignored that part. The drive took longer than expected. Once I left the main road, my phone lost signal completely. The pavement turned to gravel, then dirt, then something closer to a path than a road. The trees grew closer together, tall and dense, blocking out most of the sky. The air felt heavier, damp and cold even though it was early fall. I rolled my windows down at one point and immediately rolled them back up. The smell of wet leaves and rot was strong, not fresh like I expected. By the time I saw the cabin, it was already getting dark. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. The structure itself looked tired. The wood was gray and rough, with deep cracks running along the logs. The roof sagged slightly, like it had been carrying too much weight for too long. One of the windows was covered with plywood from the inside. The porch leaned just enough to notice. There were no lights, no signs of recent use, and no other buildings in sight. I parked my car close to the porch and shut the engine off. The silence that followed felt wrong. Not peaceful, just empty, like sound didn't travel well out there. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing moved. No insects, no birds, just the faint sound of wind moving high up in the trees. Inside, the cabin was colder than outside. The air smelled old and stale, like wood that had soaked up years of smoke and moisture. There was dust on every surface. The furniture was simple and heavy, the kind that doesn't move easily. A small table, 2 chairs, a couch with thin cushions, and a narrow bed in a separate room. Everything creaked when I touched it. The floorboards complained under my weight. Even the walls seemed to shift slightly when the wind pushed against them. I unpacked quickly, trying to beat the darkness. I turned on a lantern and set it on the table. The light barely filled the room. The corners stayed dark no matter where I placed it. I checked the windows and door. The lock was basic, old, and worn, but it worked. I told myself that was enough. That first night, I barely slept. Every sound pulled me out of whatever shallow rest I managed. Branches scraping the roof. Something small moving under the porch. The wind changing direction and making the cabin groan in a way that sounded almost intentional. I kept thinking I heard footsteps, but every time I focused, the sound disappeared into the background noise of the forest. In the morning, I noticed things I hadn't seen the night before. Deep scratches on the porch railing. Old ones, weathered but clearly made by something with weight and strength. Near the edge of the clearing, the ground looked disturbed, like it had been walked on recently. I told myself it was animals. Deer, maybe. That explanation felt thin, but I accepted it because the alternative made my chest tighten. The day passed slowly. The forest never fully came alive. It stayed quiet in a way that made time feel stretched. I tried to relax, but my body stayed tense. I caught myself checking the windows over and over, even when nothing changed outside. The feeling that I was being watched crept in slowly, not as panic, but as a steady pressure that never fully went away. That night, the sounds were clearer, heavier. Something moved around the cabin with purpose. I heard footsteps in the dirt, then on the porch. The wood creaked under the weight. It wasn't pacing. It wasn't wandering. It moved with intention, stopping near the door, then moving toward the window on the side of the cabin. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening as the steps paused beneath the bedroom window. I didn't look. I couldn't bring myself to. The idea of seeing someone standing that close, knowing I was inside, felt worse than not knowing. After a long time, the steps moved away and disappeared into the forest. The silence afterward felt heavier than the noise had been. I didn't sleep at all after that. In the morning, I found fresh boot prints around the cabin. Not old, not faint. Clear impressions in the dirt, close to the walls, beneath the windows, near the door. Whoever made them had walked slowly, carefully, circling the cabin. They hadn't tried to hide the tracks. That was the part that scared me most. Felt like they didn't care if I noticed. I considered leaving. I even loaded my car halfway. But the thought of driving that road again, of breaking down or getting stuck out there, made me hesitate. I convinced myself to stay one more night. I told myself daylight would make things clearer. Didn't. That evening, the forest grew quiet earlier than before. The air felt heavier, thicker. I pushed the table against the door and placed a chair under the handle. It wasn't much, but it was something. I kept the lantern on all night. The footsteps came back after midnight. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They moved around the cabin, slow and steady, close enough that I could hear the ground compress under each step. Something brushed against the wall, then dragged lightly across it, leaving a faint scratching sound. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. The pressure came next. The door didn't open, but it bowed slightly, just enough for the wood to creak. Whoever was outside leaned their weight against it and held it there. Not testing, not forcing, just waiting. My legs shook so badly I had to sit on the floor to keep from falling. Eventually, the pressure eased. The footsteps moved away, slower than before, as if there was no rush. I stayed frozen long after the sounds were gone. When morning finally came, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything, leaving most of it behind. I didn't care about losing things. I cared about leaving. Before I drove off, I walked behind the cabin one last time. Beneath the boarded-up window, the ground was flattened. Leaves crushed down into the dirt. Clear signs that someone had stood there for a long time, close enough to touch the wall, close enough to listen. I drove out fast, barely paying attention to the road. When I finally reached a paved highway and saw other cars, my hands were numb from gripping the steering wheel. The fear didn't leave right away. It stayed with me for days, then weeks. Later, I learned that the area was known for squatters and people living deep in the woods, avoiding towns and roads. Cabins like that weren't escapes. They were targets. Isolated places where no one would hear anything and no one would come quickly. I don't think about that cabin as a scary story anymore. I think about it as a reminder. The woods don't need anything unreal to be dangerous. Sometimes the scariest thing is another person, patient enough to wait outside in the dark, knowing exactly how alone you are. I went to the cabin because I wanted to be alone with my thoughts, not because I wanted an adventure. The place belonged to a distant relative who barely used it anymore. It sat far off an old Forest Service road, deep enough into the woods that most people didn't even know it was there. I'd been there once years earlier, just for a day, and I remembered it being quiet and dull in a way that felt safe. I thought going back for a few nights would help clear my head. The drive there already felt off. The paved road ended sooner than I remembered, replaced by a narrow dirt road with deep ruts and loose rocks. My car bounced and groaned the whole way in. Trees leaned over the road, branches scraping the roof and windows like fingers dragging across glass. There were no signs, no markers, just a single path cutting through thick forest. Once my phone lost signal, it didn't come back. The cabin came into view suddenly, sitting in a small clearing that looked forced, like the trees had been pushed back instead of naturally growing away from it. The structure was older than I remembered. The wood had darkened and cracked, and the roof dipped slightly in the middle. The porch sagged, and one of the railings leaned outward. It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look cared for either. It looked like something people had slowly stopped thinking about. When I shut off the engine, the quiet hit me hard. Not peaceful quiet, just empty. No birds, no insects, just wind high up in the trees and nothing else. I stood there longer than necessary, keys still in my hand, listening for anything that would make the place feel normal. Nothing did. Inside, the air was cold and stale. It smelled like old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic like rust and damp nails. The layout was simple. One main room with a small table, 2 chairs, a couch, and a wood stove. A short hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything creaked when I touched it. Even the walls made quiet, popping sounds as the temperature shifted. I unpacked slowly, setting my things down carefully, aware of how loud every movement sounded. The floorboards complained under my weight, especially near the hallway. I noticed deep scratches on the inside of the front door, old and worn, like someone had dragged something heavy across it at some point. I told myself it was probably from moving furniture years ago. By the time night came, the forest outside turned into a solid wall of black. The trees blocked out any moonlight. I turned on a lantern and set it on the table, but the light didn't reach the corners of the room. Shadows stayed thick and unmoving no matter how I adjusted it. That first night, sleep came in short pieces. Every time I started to drift off, some sound pulled me back. A branch snapping in the distance, wind pushing against the cabin, something moving under the porch. I kept telling myself it was animals. That explanation should have been enough, but my body didn't relax. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. No dream, no noise that I could clearly identify, just the feeling that something wasn't right. I lay still, listening. First, there was nothing. Then I heard slow movement outside. Footsteps in the dirt, heavy and spaced out. Not rushing, not wandering, moving like someone who knew exactly where they were going. The steps stopped near the porch. I heard the wood creak under weight. My chest tightened, and my mouth went dry. I waited for the door to rattle, for the latch to move. Didn't. Instead, there was a faint scraping sound along the side of the cabin, like something brushing against the wall. The footsteps moved toward the window near the bedroom and stopped. I stayed completely still. I didn't look. I didn't breathe deeper than necessary. The idea of seeing someone standing there, knowing I was inside, felt worse than not knowing. After what felt like a very long time, the steps moved away and faded into the forest. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, the cabin looked less threatening, but the feeling hadn't left. I stepped outside and immediately saw footprints in the dirt near the porch. Boot prints, clear and fresh. They came from the tree line, crossed the porch, and went back the same way. Whoever made them hadn't circled the cabin. They'd gone straight to it. I walked around the clearing slowly, scanning the ground. I found more prints near the side of the cabin, right beneath the bedroom window. The leaves were flattened, the dirt pressed down, like someone had stood there for a while. Close enough to hear breathing inside. Close enough to see movement through the glass. I told myself I would leave that day. I even started packing. But a storm rolled in by early afternoon, heavy and sudden. Rain fell hard and fast, turning the dirt road into mud. Wind picked up, pushing the trees until they creaked and snapped. Driving out in that felt risky. I convinced myself to wait it out. Just one more night. That night was worse. The storm covered some of the sounds at first, but not all of them. Between the wind and rain, I heard movement again. Footsteps on the porch, louder this time, not bothering to be quiet. The door rattled as something leaned against it. Not a test, not a mistake. Intentional pressure. The wood groaned softly. I pushed myself into the corner of the room, heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy. The pressure stayed. Whoever was outside didn't rush. They didn't force the door. They just leaned there, waiting. The storm raged around the cabin, masking everything else. After a long stretch of time, the pressure eased. The footsteps moved away, slower than before. The rain continued, but the feeling didn't lift. I stayed awake until morning, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall. When daylight came, the storm had passed. The forest looked torn up, branches scattered everywhere. I stepped outside and saw deep boot prints pressed into the wet ground all around the cabin. More than before. Whoever had been there had walked around the place multiple times. Near the back of the cabin, beneath a window I hadn't checked, the dirt was deeply disturbed. Leaves crushed, mud smeared against the wall. Clear signs that someone had been there for a long time. I didn't pack carefully this time. I grabbed what I could carry and left the rest behind. The road out was rough, but I didn't slow down. I didn't feel safe until I reached pavement and saw another car. Later, I learned that people sometimes used the forest in that area to hide. Not campers, not hikers, people who didn't want to be found. Isolated cabins weren't peaceful escapes to them. They were opportunities. I don't think about that place as a haunted cabin or some unreal horror story. Nothing supernatural happened. That's what makes it worse. It was real. It was quiet. And it was someone choosing not to knock, not to announce themselves, just standing outside in the dark, deciding how long to wait. I chose the cabin because it was off the map. Not literally, but close enough. It didn't show up on most navigation apps, and the directions were a short paragraph copied into an email. Follow the old service road. Ignore the broken mile marker. Turn where the trees thin out. Keep going even when it feels wrong. I wanted that kind of distance from everything. I didn't want noise, people, or reminders of anything waiting back home. The drive-in took longer than expected. The road narrowed until it felt like I was driving through a tunnel of trees. Branches scraped along the sides of my car, leaving thin white lines in the dust. The air smelled wet and heavy, like soil that never dried out. I hadn't seen another car for hours. When my phone lost signal, it didn't bother me. I expected that. What bothered me was how quiet everything became once I stopped the engine in front of the cabin. The cabin sat in a clearing that didn't feel natural. The trees stopped abruptly, like they had been cut back and never allowed to return. The structure itself was small, one story, dark wood faded to gray. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch leaned to the right just enough to make my balance feel off when I stepped onto it. One window was covered from the inside with plywood. The others were narrow and thick, old glass with a slight distortion that warped whatever you looked at through them. Inside, the smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, and something sour underneath it all, like fabric that had stayed damp too long. The place was colder than outside. I could see my breath for a few seconds before it faded. The floor creaked under every step, loud enough that I found myself moving slower without meaning to. The furniture was heavy and worn. Scratches ran along the table legs and the arms of the couch. Not damage from age, damage from repeated use. I unpacked quickly, wanting to get settled before dark. I noticed there was no power except for a small generator outside, and I decided to save it for later. I set a lantern on the table and watched the light struggle to fill the room. The corners stayed dark no matter how I adjusted it. The hallway leading to the bedroom felt especially narrow, like the walls leaned inward. Night came fast. Once the sun dropped behind the trees, the forest turned into a solid wall of black. No distant lights, no glow, just darkness pressed up against the windows. I locked the door more out of habit than fear, though the lock itself was old and loose, the kind that made noise when you turned it. I tried to sleep early, but it didn't last. Every sound pulled me back awake. Wind moving through the trees, branches brushing the roof, something small scurrying under the porch. I told myself it was animals. That explanation worked for my head but not my body. My shoulders stayed tight. My jaw stayed clenched. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. No dream, no obvious noise, just the feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay still, listening. First, there was nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and heavy, moving through dirt. Not pacing, not wandering, coming straight toward the cabin. The steps reached the porch. The wood creaked under the weight. I could hear someone shifting their stance, like they were standing there deciding something. My heart pounded so hard it felt loud in my ears. I waited for a knock that never came. Instead, something brushed against the door. Not forceful, just contact, like someone testing how solid it felt. After a long stretch of time, the weight moved away. The footsteps retreated, swallowed by the forest. I stayed frozen long after the sounds were gone. When I finally forced myself to move, I checked the door and windows. Everything looked the same. That somehow made it worse. In the morning, I stepped outside and immediately saw the footprints. Boot prints in the dirt near the porch. Fresh, clear. They came from the tree line, stopped at the porch, and went back the same way. Whoever made them hadn't circled the cabin. They'd gone straight to it. I walked around the clearing, scanning the ground. Near the bedroom window, the leaves were flattened. The dirt was packed down, like someone had stood there for a while. Close enough to see inside. Close enough to hear breathing. I should have left then. I knew that. Instead, I convinced myself there had to be a simple explanation. A hunter. Someone passing through. Someone curious. None of those explanations explained why they came back in the middle of the night and stood silently at my door. The day dragged on. The forest stayed quiet, like it was holding its breath. I kept checking the windows without realizing I was doing it. Every time the wind shifted, my heart jumped. When evening came, I prepared differently. I pushed the table against the door. I placed a chair under the handle. It wouldn't stop anyone determined enough, but it made me feel less exposed. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They moved around the cabin, slow and steady, close enough that I could hear the ground compress under each step. Something brushed along the wall, then dragged lightly across it, leaving a faint scratching sound. I could tell where they were by the sound alone. They knew the layout now. The pressure against the door came next. Not a shove. Not an attempt to break in. Just weight leaning into it. The wood creaked softly. The table shifted slightly. Whoever was outside stayed there for a long time. Long enough for my legs to start shaking. Long enough for my throat to feel raw from breathing too quietly. Eventually, the pressure eased. The footsteps moved away, slower than before. Not rushed. Not disappointed. Just patient. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat against the wall and waited for daylight. When morning came, I stepped outside and felt sick almost immediately. There were more footprints than before. Multiple sets. All around the cabin. Near every window. Near the back wall. Whoever had been there hadn't been alone this time. Near the boarded-up window, the ground was deeply disturbed. Mud smeared against the wall. Leaves crushed flat. Clear signs that someone had stood there for a long time, listening. I didn't pack carefully. I grabbed what I could carry and left the rest behind. As I pulled away, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint path leading away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. It wasn't a trail. It was a route. One that had been used enough to keep the ground packed down. I drove out as fast as the road allowed. When I finally reached pavement and saw another car, my hands were numb from gripping the wheel. The fear didn't fade right away. It stayed with me, heavy and quiet. Later, I learned the area had a history of people living off the grid. Not hikers, not campers, people hiding, using abandoned land and forgotten structures to stay out of sight. Cabins like that weren't escapes. They were resources. I don't think about that place as haunted or cursed. Nothing unreal happened there. That's what makes it worse. It was just people close enough to touch the walls while I sat inside pretending not to exist, waiting to see if I would make a mistake. I went to the cabin because I thought being alone would make things quieter inside my head. I had been running on stress for months, sleeping poorly, always feeling watched by deadlines and expectations. The cabin was something I remembered from years ago, owned by someone who stopped using it and didn't care if it sat empty. It was deep in the woods, far enough that nobody passed by unless they had a reason. I thought that kind of isolation would be calming. I was wrong. The drive out there already felt uncomfortable. The paved road ended earlier than I expected, turning into a narrow dirt track with deep grooves worn into it. My car rocked side to side as I followed it, branches scraping along the doors and roof. The trees grew thicker the farther I went, tall and close together, blocking out most of the sky. The air felt damp and heavy, like it carried old smells that never left. When my phone lost signal, it happened suddenly, and the screen felt useless in my hand after that. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon. It sat in a small clearing that looked unnatural, like the forest had been pushed back instead of growing away naturally. The building itself looked older than I remembered. The wood had darkened and cracked, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. The porch leaned just enough to notice, and one of the steps felt soft under my weight. There were no tire tracks around the cabin, no signs of recent visitors. That should have felt reassuring, but instead it made me feel exposed. When I shut off the engine, the quiet was immediate and complete. No distant traffic, no voices, not even birds. Just wind moving high up in the trees. I stood there longer than I meant to, keys still in my hand, listening for something that would make the place feel normal. Nothing did. Inside, the cabin smelled old and stale. Dust hung in the air, catching the light when I opened the door. The floorboards creaked loudly under every step, like they were announcing my presence. The layout was simple. One main room with a small table, 2 chairs, and a couch that sagged in the middle. A short hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The windows were small and thick, and one of them had been boarded up from the inside. I noticed deep scratches on the inside of the front door, worn down by time but still visible. I told myself it was from moving furniture years ago. I unpacked slowly, placing my things carefully, aware of how loud every movement sounded. I set a lantern on the table and turned it on. The light filled the center of the room but left the corners dark. No matter where I placed it, the shadows stayed thick, especially near the hallway. I tried to ignore that. As night came, the forest outside disappeared into darkness. There was no moonlight reaching the cabin, no glow from anywhere else, just black pressed up against the windows. I locked the door even though the lock felt weak and old. It clicked loudly, and the sound echoed in the quiet. That first night, I barely slept. Every noise pulled me awake. The wind pushed against the cabin, making the walls creak and shift. Branches scraped the roof and sides, sometimes slow, sometimes sharp. Something moved under the porch at one point, light and quick. I told myself it was animals. That explanation made sense, but my body stayed tense anyway. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. No dream, no clear sound, just the feeling that something was wrong. I lay still, listening. First, there was nothing. Then I heard footsteps outside, slow and heavy, moving through dirt. They weren't random. They weren't pacing. They were coming straight toward the cabin. The footsteps reached the porch. The wood creaked under the weight. I could hear someone shifting their stance, like they were standing there deciding what to do. My heart started pounding so hard it felt like it might give me away. I waited for a knock. It never came. Instead, something brushed against the door lightly, almost careful. Not a push, not an attempt to open it, just contact. After a long stretch of time, the weight moved away. The footsteps retreated, fading into the forest. I stayed completely still long after the sounds were gone. When I finally forced myself to move, I checked the door and windows. Nothing looked disturbed. That didn't make me feel better. In the morning, I stepped outside and saw the footprints immediately. Boot prints in the dirt near the porch, fresh and clear. They came from the tree line, stopped at the porch, and went back the same way. Whoever made them hadn't wandered. They had come straight to the cabin. I walked around the clearing slowly. Near the bedroom window, the leaves were flattened, and the dirt was packed down. Someone had stood there for a while, close enough to look inside, close enough to listen. My stomach tightened when I realized how exposed I had been. I told myself I would leave that day. I even started packing, but the thought of driving that road again, alone and far from help, made me hesitate. I convinced myself there had to be a normal explanation. A hunter, someone passing through, someone curious. None of those explanations explained why they came silently in the middle of the night and left without a trace beyond their footprints. The day felt long and heavy. The forest stayed quiet, like it was waiting. I kept checking the windows without realizing it. Every time the wind shifted, my body reacted before my mind did. As evening came, I prepared the cabin as best I could. I pushed the table against the door. I wedged a chair under the handle. It wouldn't stop anyone determined enough, but it made me feel less exposed. That night, the footsteps came back. They were closer this time, louder. They didn't stop at the porch. They moved around the cabin, slow and steady, close enough that I could hear the ground compress under each step. Something brushed along the wall, then dragged lightly across it, leaving a faint scratching sound. I could tell where they were by the sound alone. They knew the layout now. The pressure against the door came next. Not a shove, not an attempt to break in, just weight leaning into it. The wood creaked softly. The table shifted slightly. Whoever was outside stayed there for a long time. Long enough for my legs to start shaking. Long enough for my breathing to feel loud even when I tried to control it. Eventually, the pressure eased. The footsteps moved away, slower than before. Not rushed, not disappointed, just patient. I didn't sleep after that. I sat against the wall and waited for daylight. When morning came, I stepped outside and felt sick almost immediately. There were more footprints than before, multiple sets, all around the cabin, near every window, near the back wall. Whoever had been there hadn't been alone. Beneath the boarded-up window, the ground was deeply disturbed. Mud smeared against the wall, leaves crushed flat. Clear signs that someone had stood there for a long time, listening. I didn't pack carefully. I grabbed what I could carry and left the rest behind. As I pulled away, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint path leading away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. It wasn't a hiking trail. It was a route worn down by repeated use. I drove out as fast as the road allowed. When I finally reached pavement and saw another car, my hands were numb from gripping the wheel. The fear didn't fade right away. It stayed with me, heavy and quiet. Later, I learned that the forest around that cabin had been used by people who wanted to stay hidden. Not campers, not hikers, people living off the grid, avoiding towns and attention. Isolated cabins weren't peaceful escapes to them. They were resources, shelters, places to watch from. Nothing supernatural happened out there. That's what makes it stick with me. It was real, it was quiet, and it was people standing just outside, close enough to touch the walls, waiting to see if I would make a mistake. I went to the cabin because it was supposed to be boring. That was the appeal. No views worth photographing, no trails worth hiking, no neighbors to run into. Just a plain wooden cabin sitting deep in a stretch of forest most people drove past without noticing. I didn't want excitement. I wanted time to pass without anything happening. The road in was worse than I expected. After the last paved stretch ended, the dirt road narrowed until my side mirrors were brushing leaves. The ground was uneven, and my tires slipped in places where mud hadn't dried in years. I drove slowly, partly to avoid damage, partly because something about rushing felt wrong. The forest was thick and close, trees packed tight like they were guarding something. The air smelled damp and heavy, like wet bark and rot. When my phone lost signal, it happened all at once. 1 second it worked, the next it didn't. I checked it twice, then put it away. The cabin came into view suddenly, sitting in a shallow dip in the land. It looked lower than the surrounding forest, like the ground had settled around it. The building itself was simple and old. Dark wood, faded and cracked. The roof sagged slightly, and the chimney leaned just enough to notice. One side of the porch had collapsed and been roughly repaired with mismatched boards. It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look maintained either. I parked close and shut off the engine. The silence afterward was immediate and thick. No insects, no birds, just the faint sound of wind high up in the trees. I stayed in the car longer than I needed to, hands on the steering wheel, listening. Nothing changed. Inside, the air felt stale and cold. It smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly sour. The floorboards creaked loudly under my weight, even near the doorway, like they weren't used to being stepped on anymore. The main room held a small table, 2 chairs, a couch with worn cushions, and a wood stove that looked functional but rarely used. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and bathroom. The windows were small and thick, and the glass distorted the view outside just enough to make the forest look closer than it really was. I noticed right away that some things weren't where I expected them to be. The lantern sat on the table instead of the shelf. A chair was pulled slightly away from the wall. Small details that didn't mean much on their own. I told myself someone must have been there recently to clean or check on the place. That explanation felt reasonable at the time. I unpacked and settled in before dark. I ran the generator briefly to check the lights, then shut it off to save fuel. When night came, it came fast. The forest swallowed what little light remained, and the cabin felt cut off from the world. I locked the door and checked the windows out of habit. The lock was old but solid. The windows latched properly. I told myself that was enough. That first night, I slept lightly. Every sound woke me. The cabin shifted as temperatures dropped, wood popping and creaking. Branches brushed the roof and walls. Something small moved under the porch, quick and light. I kept telling myself it was animals. That explanation made sense, but it didn't calm me the way it should have. In the morning, I noticed more things out of place. The cooler lid wasn't fully closed. The generator cover had been moved. Not much, but enough that I could tell it hadn't been left that way. I checked my food. Nothing obvious was missing, but some items had shifted. I stood there for a long moment, trying to remember if I had done it myself. Couldn't be sure. I stepped outside to clear my head and immediately saw the footprints. Boot prints in the dirt near the generator. Fresh, clear. They weren't mine. I hadn't been back there since arriving. The prints led away from the cabin and disappeared into the trees. The realization hit slowly, then all at once. Someone had been there while I slept. Not passing through, not wandering. They'd gone straight to the equipment, straight to the food. I walked the perimeter of the cabin carefully. Near the back wall, beneath a window, the leaves were flattened and the dirt packed down. Someone had stood there for a while, close enough to look inside, close enough to listen. I told myself I would leave that day. I meant it, but as I packed, doubt crept in. The road out was long and rough. My car was loaded but not built for bad terrain. I convinced myself to stay one more night, to leave in daylight the next morning when I felt calmer. It was a bad decision, and I knew it even then. That afternoon, the forest felt different, quieter than before. The air felt heavy, like before a storm, but the sky stayed clear. I checked the generator again and noticed the fuel cap was loose. I knew I had tightened it the day before. Someone had touched it again. When night came, I prepared as best I could. I pushed the table against the door and wedged a chair under the handle. I kept the lantern on. The shadows it cast were harsh, but I didn't want darkness. The sounds started late. Footsteps in the dirt, slow and deliberate. They didn't rush. They didn't circle aimlessly. They came straight to the cabin. The porch creaked under weight. Someone stopped at the door. I could hear breathing outside, faint but real. Not wind, not animals. The handle moved slightly, just enough to test it. The table shifted a fraction of an inch. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy. The handle stopped moving. The weight leaned against the door, steady and patient. Whoever was outside didn't force it. They waited. After a long time, the pressure eased. The footsteps moved away, slow and controlled. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. I waited for light. When morning came, I stepped outside and felt sick. There were footprints everywhere. More than one set. Around the door. Beneath every window. Near the generator. Near my car. One set led right up to the driver's side door and stopped there. The car started, but barely. The engine hesitated, coughing before catching. I didn't shut it off again. I loaded what I could and left everything else behind. As I pulled away, I noticed something else. The dirt road had fresh tire marks that weren't mine. Someone else had been using it recently. Someone who knew exactly where the cabin was. The drive out felt endless. Every bend made my chest tighten. When I finally reached pavement and saw another car, the tension broke all at once. My hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over. Later, I reported what happened. The response was calm, almost tired. The area had problems, they said. People living deep in the woods, avoiding towns, watching places like that for supplies. Cabins weren't retreats to them. They were opportunities. I don't think about that cabin as a place I escaped from at the last second. I think about it as a place I stayed too long. Nothing supernatural happened. No voices, no figures in the dark. Just people close enough to touch my things, patient enough to wait, knowing exactly how alone I was. That's what stays with me. I went to the cabin in December because it was empty, cheap, and far away from everything that reminded me the year was ending. I didn't want lights, music, or people pretending to be happy. I wanted cold air, silence, and days that blended together. The cabin sat deep in the woods, accessible only by an old service road that barely showed up on a map. I was told it would be difficult in winter, but manageable if the weather held. I convinced myself I could handle it. The drive-in took almost twice as long as expected. Snow had fallen a few days earlier, and the plows clearly didn't come this far out. The road was packed with ice in some spots and loose snow in others. My tires slipped more than once, and every time they did, my chest tightened. The trees were bare and dark, their branches reaching over the road like thin arms. Everything looked lifeless. The sky was gray and low, like it was pressing down on the forest. By the time I reached the cabin, daylight was already fading. December days don't give you much time. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by snow-covered trees. It looked smaller than I remembered, hunched under the weight of winter. The roof was layered with snow, and long icicles hung from the edges. The porch steps were half buried, uneven, and slick with ice. There were no fresh tire tracks around the place, which made sense but still bothered me. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening. The forest was silent in a way that only happens in winter. No insects, no birds, just a faint wind moving through the treetops. The cold settled in immediately when I opened the car door. Felt sharp, biting through my jacket. I grabbed my bag and moved quickly to the porch, careful not to slip. Inside, the cabin was colder than outside. The air felt dead and heavy, like it hadn't moved in a long time. The smell was familiar but unpleasant. Old wood, dust, and something slightly sour like damp fabric that never fully dried. My breath showed in the air. I turned on the lantern and watched the light struggle against the darkness. The walls absorbed it, leaving the corners thick and shadowed. The cabin was simple. One main room with a table, 2 chairs, a couch, and a wood stove. A short hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything looked the same as I remembered, but worse. The wood was more cracked, the furniture more worn. The floorboards creaked loudly under every step, especially near the hallway. I noticed dark marks on the floor near the stove, like old boot prints ground into the wood over time. I unpacked slowly, trying to warm the place up. Starting the fire took longer than expected. The wood was dry, but the cold fought every spark. When the fire finally caught, the crackling sound felt comforting, but it didn't bring much heat at first. I kept my jacket on and rubbed my hands together, watching the flames like they might solve everything. Night came fast. By the time the fire was steady, the windows were already black. Snow reflected just enough light to show vague shapes outside, but nothing clear. I locked the door out of habit, even though the lock was old and loose. I checked the windows too. They were thick and latched, but one of them rattled slightly when the wind picked up. That first night was long. The cold seeped into everything. The fire helped, but the cabin never fully warmed. I slept on the couch near the stove, wrapped in blankets, waking up often to add more wood. Every sound felt louder in the quiet. The stove popping as the wood burned. The wind pressing against the walls. Snow sliding off the roof in slow, heavy shifts. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was darker than before. At first, I didn't know what woke me. Then I heard it. A crunching sound outside. Slow, deliberate. Footsteps in the snow. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped, then started again, closer this time. They moved around the side of the cabin, close enough that I could hear the snow compress under weight. Not light like an animal, heavy, human. The steps reached the porch. The boards creaked softly under the weight. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, each beat loud in my ears. I waited for a knock. It never came. Instead, there was a faint scraping sound near the door, like someone brushing snow off their boots or adjusting their stance. The footsteps moved away after a while, disappearing into the forest. I stayed still long after the sound was gone, staring into the darkness. I told myself it could have been someone lost, a hunter, anyone. None of those explanations felt solid. In the morning, the light revealed things I hadn't seen the night before. Fresh footprints in the snow near the porch. Boot prints, clear and deep. They came from the tree line, stopped at the door, then circled the cabin before heading back the same way. Whoever made them didn't rush. They took their time. I followed the prints as far as I could without going into the trees. They disappeared where the snow was deeper. Near one of the windows, the snow was packed down, like someone had stood there for a while. Close enough to look inside. Close enough to see the firelight. The rest of the day dragged. The sky stayed gray, and the temperature didn't rise much. I kept the fire going and tried to stay busy, but my attention kept drifting to the windows. The forest felt closer than before, like it was slowly leaning in. That night, the snow started again. Thick flakes falling fast, muffling sound. I told myself that was good. It meant fewer people out there. It meant quiet. I locked the door, pushed the table against it, and kept the fire burning brighter than before. The footsteps came back after dark. They were harder to hear because of the snow, but I felt them more than I heard them. The porch creaked. The door rattled slightly when someone leaned against it. Not hard, not trying to break in, just testing, waiting. I sat frozen on the couch, barely breathing. The pressure against the door stayed for a long time. Long enough that my legs started to shake. Long enough that my mouth felt dry and my throat hurt from breathing too quietly. Eventually, the pressure eased. The footsteps moved away, slow and steady. Not rushed, not panicked, just patient. I didn't sleep after that. Morning came late and dim. The snow had covered everything again, but the signs were still there. More footprints, more than one set this time, around every window, near the back of the cabin, near my car. One set stopped right at the driver's door. The car didn't start right away. The engine struggled, turning over slowly before finally catching. I didn't shut it off again. I threw my bag in the back, leaving most of my things behind. As I pulled away, I noticed something I hadn't before. A narrow path leading away from the cabin into the trees, packed down from repeated use, barely visible under the snow. The drive out was tense and slow. The road was worse than before, and my hands stayed tight on the wheel the entire time. When I finally reached pavement and saw another car, the fear hit me all at once. My hands shook so badly I had to pull over. Later, I learned that winter cabins like that attract people who don't want to be seen. People who move through forests when everyone else stays home. Snow doesn't scare them, it hides them. Nothing unreal happened in that cabin. No ghosts, no strange lights, just December cold, isolation, and people who knew exactly how quiet the woods could be. I don't think about that place when winter comes around anymore. I think about how thin the walls were, how close someone stood in the dark, and how patience can be far scarier than force.